I want to tell you a story from the Bible that causes most people to simply just turn the page due to confusion or simply because it's pretty grotesque. And I don't blame you, but I believe this story, given its given context, will have you on the edge of your seats, waiting for more. Don't believe me? Well, would you believe the success of things like Game of Thrones, House of Cards, or maybe even House of the Dragon? Yes, that is the level of political scheming and twisted narrative that this part of the Bible contains. I'm talking about Genesis chapter 38. This video will serve as an introduction, a part one have you, to this discussion. There are several things to consider and digest about these stories, and if they're unfamiliar to you, you're gonna get lost in the discussion. So this video will help serve as an introduction to the subject, explaining the two different narratives and introducing some of the things that connect them. In part two of the discussion, I will be talking with Dead Sea Scrolls scholar Dr. Kip Davis in order to better connect these narratives and to learn what we should take away as readers from Genesis chapter 38, as well as the succession narrative. So be sure to check that one out after this video. It's an odd story, seemingly just randomly thrown into the middle of the story of Joseph and all his brothers, and it's a story about Joseph's older brother named Judah, like the tribe of Judah, and how he went off and established his own life with his own family. But like many things in life, things got very ugly and very complicated very quickly. This story serves as a backdrop to an even crazier part of Scripture that scholars deem the succession narrative. The succession narrative is a part of Scripture documenting the events that led up to the crowning of King Solomon over Israel. Despite the fact that he had several older brothers, Solomon still became the next king of Israel. So, for the sake of this video, in order to get the most out of it that you can, I have a request of you. I'm asking you to set aside any preconceived notions that you might have about the Bible. Not get rid of them entirely, just set them aside for this conversation here and now so that you can truly hear and consider what I have to say today. I would like you to consider this story about Judah in Genesis chapter 38 is actually a tale that the pro-Solomon campaign in Israel told in order to legitimize him as the next king of Israel. A remnant, have you, of political propaganda to win the throne of Israel. The succession narrative is found in 2 Samuel chapter 9, and it goes through 1 Kings chapter 11. It's a bloody narrative with lots of imagery about being dominant physically and in some other ways. I'm sure many of you can imagine what I'm talking about, so suffice to say, this is my quick disclaimer that this video will not be suitable for children. As I mentioned in the introduction, the story of Judah in Genesis chapter 38 seems to be a political narrative to showcase Solomon as the next rightful ruler in Israel. That is not entirely true, at least from a scholarly perspective. The truth is that scholars debate whether this story is being told to legitimize Solomon as king or to instead showcase the current king at the time, King David, as a wrongful king who usurped the throne from King Saul. It's a very interesting debate, and as we dive into the two narratives, I think you'll see why it could be taken either way. So what is in Genesis chapter 38? Here's a quick summary. We have Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, who leaves his family to establish his own family. He leaves and stays with a man named Hira, who's from a Canaanite city called Adullam. At this time, Judah does what he needs to do to start a family. He gets married. Woo! Come on now, Judah! To a daughter of someone named Shua, and the two of them have 3 sons named Onan, and Shelah. What a lovely family. Years later, Judah's first son gets married to a woman named Tamar. But things don't last, and Judah's son suddenly dies, leaving Tamar a widow. Now, at the time, it was custom to have the younger brother marry the wife of his older brother if his brother were to pass away. So, in this case, Judah sets Tamar up with his second son, Onan. However, Onan didn't want to be with Tamar because he knew that any child that he would have with his older brother's widow would not be considered his child. Ancient logic, am I right? So while Onan and Tamar were doing the deed on their wedding night, Onan shamed Tamar by pulling out and failing to impregnate her. This was a big no-no in the ancient Near East. So because Onan did this, God kills him instantly. Boom! Roasted. However, this now left Tamar a widow for the second time, which is just extremely shameful for her and for Judah, who is supposedly the leader of this family. So Judah does his due diligence as a sophisticated ancient patriarch. Thank you very much. Judah promises Tamar his third son, Shelah, to be her husband as soon as he grows old enough to get married. So all is well until Shelah grows old enough to get married, but Judah doesn't do anything about it. He just lets his son continue to stay a bachelor as long as he pleases. So Tamar, realizing that Judah is not going to fulfill his end of the deal, decides to take things into her own hands. Tamar disguises herself as a prostitute and goes out and seduces her father-in-law Judah into having sex with her. Yeah, pretty crazy. From this escapade, Tamar becomes pregnant, and the news of Tamar's pregnancy reaches Judah, making him extremely angry. He just cannot believe that his daughter-in-law would hook up with some Canaanite loser instead of waiting to marry his last son. That is, until Tamar reveals that Judah is that Canaanite loser that got her pregnant. Judah failed to fulfill his promise to Tamar. So Tamar took things into her own hands and got herself pregnant to keep her from the shame of not producing any sons for the family. The story ends with Judah recognizing his failure and publicly apologizing about it, and then later praising his daughter-in-law Tamar for taking action. End of Genesis chapter 38. Whew. I mean, that was just insane. But folks, that's the Bible for you. And believe me, that doesn't even compare to the crazy things happening in the ancient Israelite world when this story was written. This story has several elements that speak to the potential happenings of the time. And in order to truly understand this story about Judah, we'll actually need to dive into the succession narrative of the Hebrew Bible. Now, this is a large part of Scripture with several names and complex relationships and many crazy stories that you can all read in the Bible. I'm not going to cover every single detail here in this video. That would take far too long. Rather, in this video, I'm going to cover some of the main characters and the big events that define this section of Scripture. The first part in the narrative involves King David himself, the current king of Israel. David seems to be beloved by the people in Israel, but this part of Scripture shows his failure more than anything else. It's very similar to how the Bible portrays Judah, who's actually the ancestor of David and later of Jesus. Judah, David, and Jesus are all linked in several ways, and it's important to understand this as we compare these two sections of scripture. Just like Judah, David is well respected and is known as a great leader of Israel. Also like Judah, David fails to do his duty, which is where our story begins. The story of David and Bathsheba. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this section of the succession narrative, but to summarize it, it's a story about David's greatest failure. One night, while David is at his palace, he goes to the roof of his palace to do some tomfoolery, namely to peep on a woman named Bathsheba as she was bathing. This event later leads David to then summoning Bathsheba to his bedroom, where he goes on to rape her. Now, because of this, Bathsheba, who is already married, gets pregnant with David's son. And to cover his mistake, David asks Bathsheba's husband, who is out fighting a war for him, to come back and to sleep with his wife as a way of covering things up. Now, the husband, whose name is Uriah, declines the offer, leaving David in a tough situation. Instead of doing the right thing, though, he decides to get Uriah killed by sending him to the front lines of the battlefield without any support. Uriah dies, and David marries Bathsheba and claims that the son is his son from within wedlock. Now, David gets called out about this scummy business, and after that, he publicly confesses his sin. This kicks off the beginning of David's failures as king. David, the great ruler of Israel who slaughtered Goliath, fails his army, his country, and his family. Now, due to this failure, God kills the son that David was going to have with Bathsheba. But we aren't done with Bathsheba just yet. Just like Tamar, in the story with Judah, she too is going to redeem herself from this messy situation. This first story is what scholars deem the trial of David. And the next big event in the succession narrative is called the trial of Amnon, David's firstborn son. In the second part of the narrative, we have Amnon, the next in line to the throne of Israel. Except Amnon has never officially been declared the next in line. David, who is supposed to name an heir to the throne, just hasn't gotten to doing that yet. So we have Amnon, the supposed next in line to the throne, but he really doesn't have much backing his claim. We also have the next oldest son of David, Absalom, who, like Amnon, has an interest in becoming king, making these two brothers rivals. Now, Absalom has a sister who has an interesting name, Tamar. This is the only other Tamar in the entire Bible, sans the later daughter of Absalom, who he's going to name after his sister, but that's just mentioned once. These are the only two Tamars who are actually talked about in narrative form. Connection? I think so. Now, David's oldest son, Amnon, half-brother to Absalom and Tamar, actually develops a crush on his younger half-sister. It's the ancient Near East, man. I mean, it happens. Due to this, Amnon grows sick with desire and asks his father to let his sister Tamar bring him some food. You know, sick man, he needs to eat, right? Innocent enough. However, King David would seemingly know that this could be a ploy of Amnon to assert dominance over his younger brother, Absalom, by messing with Absalom's sister. You see, Absalom and Tamar were really, really close. They loved each other. They were as close can be. They were basically homies. But regardless, David allows Tamar to visit Amnon and to give him some food. But when Tamar goes to do this, Amnon forces himself onto his sister. Now, after this, Amnon makes an even worse mistake, if you can believe it, at least in terms of ancient Israel. After sleeping with Tamar, he sends her away from him and does not do the right thing in marrying her. Marriage would have been a way of protecting Tamar, but now, in essence, what Amnon has done is leave Tamar a single mom. A single mom that can't support a child because she can't get a job because she's a woman. That's the ancient world for you. Not to mention the added shame at the time of being an unmarried woman that's lost her virginity. That is exactly what Tamar now has to deal with. Deep, deep shame. Now, after this, Absalom becomes just absolutely furious. Now, he doesn't act immediately. In fact, he waits years to get his revenge. But his revenge comes when he asks his father, King David, to let his brother Amnon come see him, to help him out, to help him shear some sheep. A sheep shearing party, have you? What could go wrong with that? David hesitantly allows this. And sure enough, as soon as Amnon arrives at the sheep shearing festival, Absalom kills him. And because of this, Absalom is now the next in line to become king of Israel. But David does not make it officially so. Probably because, he killed his older brother. But I mean, come on. David has got to step in and take care of this situation. But still, he does nothing. He does not name an heir to the throne. And so we have Absalom, who is furious at his father for allowing Amnon to mess with his sister, and now has grown in courage by killing his own brother, his own rival, to the throne. So begins the third part of the narrative, the trial of Absalom. Basically, what we have is an angry prince who has fled the capital in fear of his father, but also resentment with his father because of the way that he's just been handling this entire situation. Now, some years pass, and Absalom is finally accepted back to Jerusalem to be around his father. However, the resentment remains, and Absalom is a pretty cunning guy. Absalom works to gain a following in order to form a rebellion against his father. He later flees from Jerusalem again to go to the city of Hebron, and there he anoints himself as the king of Israel. Dun, dun, dun. Now, Hebron is a significant place because it's actually the place that David himself was anointed as king. Absalom rallies an army against his father, causing his dad to then flee from Jerusalem himself. In David's stead, Absalom conquers the capital and publicly has sex with 20 of David's concubines as a form of asserting his dominance. Yep, that just happened. Absalom, who's now at the top of the world, feeling uber confident, decides to march out to meet his father in battle at the forest of Ephraim. However, while fighting, Absalom meets his end. As he is riding on his mule, fighting in the forest, Absalom gets its head caught in a tree and is left dangling in the air. Not a great look, if you ask me. David's commander, Joab, then kills the dangling prince, and David's throne is protected from his son's rebellion. But his victory does not come without a cost. You see, the beloved King David has now let not one, not two, but 3 of his sons die. He has lost control of family affairs, and the women in his house, his daughter and concubines, have been horrendously abused. Not to mention that David has contributed to the abuse in the rape of Bathsheba. David, while being publicly penitent, has lost the trust of many people in Israel. This is potentially what led to the writing of the story in Genesis 38, highlighting a great man like Judah or David and their failure to honor and protect their family. This leads to the final part in the succession narrative, the trial of Adonijah, David's 4th and now oldest son. I'd like to remind you of Bathsheba because I mentioned earlier that she would go on to redeem herself, similar to the way that Tamar redeems herself in Genesis chapter 38. Bathsheba's first son with David is killed by God because of David's sin, but the two of them go on to have a second son, whose name is Solomon. Solomon is one of David's youngest sons, but the succession narrative shows how, despite all odds being stacked against him, he ends up becoming the next king of Israel. Now, Adonijah is the last major block from Solomon becoming king, and Bathsheba knows this. At this time, Adonijah starts going around and claiming that he will become the next king in Israel. He goes and hosts a feast and invites several important people from David's council, including David's own commander, Joab, to join his cause. At the same time, Bathsheba goes to the king, who has still failed to name an heir, and petitions for King David to name her son Solomon as the next heir. The two had talked previously about making Solomon heir, but Bathsheba pleased to David to make it publicly official. And so David names Solomon as his heir at Bathsheba's request. And finally, David has done what he has always, from the beginning, been required to do. Way to go, David. Way to go. You finally did it. I'm proud of you. After some time, David passes away due to old age, leaving Adonijah unhappy with the outcome. He feels that the throne was stolen from him, and he definitely does not want to submit to his young punk brother. And thus, this section of the narrative ends with Adonijah's last-ditch attempt. Adonijah asks King Solomon to be given one of David's old harems, a woman named Abishag, to him in marriage. And Solomon realizes this is a ploy. And so as soon as this request is made, Solomon makes quick work of his older brother, summoning him to be executed, safeguarding his right to the throne. Thus ends the succession narrative and begins the reign of King Solomon. Now, how exactly is this story about Judah connected to the events that occur in the succession narrative? I won't go into all the details here because I'll be talking about this with Dr. Kip Davis in a future conversation, but I'll introduce some of the concepts so that you can get your mind thinking about this as we enter the next video. Here is a chart documenting all the different similarities among the two narratives. Both narratives have a shepherd that leaves his kinsmen from Adullam. Both narratives have a main character with a close ally, Judah's friend being Hirah from Adullam, and David's close ally being King Hiram of Tyre. Additionally, these two friends, in the original Hebrew language, have names that are exactly the same excluding one letter, Mem, in the Genesis 38 story with Judah. Both main characters, David and Judah, also have wives with the same name. Judah's wife is the daughter of Shua, otherwise known in the Hebrew as Bat Shua, whereas David's wife's name is Bathsheba, or Bat Sheba in the original Hebrew. Both names are only different because of this letter, again, Mem, which was added to the name in the story with Judah. Judah's first son, suddenly dies, and David's first son, at least mentioned in the narrative, also suddenly dies as a punishment for his sin. Judah's second son, Onan, is sexually immoral and is later killed by God. Additionally, David's next son mentioned in the story, Amnon, is also sexually immoral and is also later killed by God at the hands of Absalom. And guess what? These two names are the exact same in the Hebrew, besides the fact that the letter Mem has been added to the name of Judah's son in Genesis 38. Both narratives include the leader of a family failing to do their duty, Both narratives have a woman, Tamar, and Bathsheba that take matters into their own hands to fix the problems that the leader of the family has been causing or allowing to happen. And both narratives have a strong leader that is publicly shamed and publicly sorry for their mistakes. As you can see, there are even more details I didn't even mention that were in the chart linking these two passages, but I'll leave that for Dr. Davis. In the meantime, I would like to ask you to consider something for me. Is the Bible literal? Meaning, are all the stories in the Bible actual historic events? Might there perchance be the possibility that it's both historical, mythology, and folklore all mixed in to one? I'm not claiming that the entire Bible is unhistorical. In fact, this whole video should show that that is not the case. However, what I would like you to consider, given this one example, is the fact that not every story or event in the Bible is literal, but that Scripture is a collection of history as well as mythology and wisdom literature that all serves to benefit the reader. Whether or not Judah actually had 3 sons named Onan, and Shelah, or if he actually slept with his daughter-in-law Tamar, we can still learn something from this story. In fact, I think this story teaches us more about history than it would if it were just a simple account of a Bronze Age event. That's food for thought. You don't have to accept it, just consider it. And let's continue. Continue to be curious, continue to seek understanding, and continue on to the next video as I speak about this issue and much more with Dr. Kip Davis. I'll see you over there.